My name is John Nelson. I'm with Retirement Plan Advisory Group, and I'm here today to present the Fiduciary Hot Topics session for Q4 2022. I'm going to talk about three things in particular today. I'm going to talk about the recent extension of the time to amend plan documents for CARES Act and Secures Act. I'm going to also mention the idea of using alternative investments inside of 401k plans. And I'll also talk about a little bit about ESG and 401k plans as well. Let's go ahead and get started. Well, first, let's talk about the plan sponsors get 3 additional years to adopt some of the amendments required by the CARES Act and the Secure Act. Actually, this is notice 2022-33. That's a typo on the outline. That should actually be 33, not 23. What this does is this gives extensions to plan sponsors to amend their plans to comply with the CARES Act. Now, some of you remember the CARES Act was enacted all the way back in March of 2020, and it basically allowed plan sponsors to amend their plans to allow participants to take one-time distributions up to $100,000 or take increased participant loans up to $100,000. So that was enacted back in 2020. Many plan sponsors adopted those provisions, but haven't yet amended the plan. So even though you operated, you still had time to actually amend the plan to put that change in. Secure Act was actually enacted back in December of 2019. And once again, some of those rules were effective January 1, 2020. So you're operating in compliance with those rules, but you haven't had to actually physically amend the document until the due date was December 31st, 2022. But now that due date has been extended to December 31, 2025. That's regardless of whether you're a fiscal year plan or a calendar year plan, 12/31/2025. Now, I just want to kind of put this in context. Remember, you're operating in compliance with these terms, but the plan hasn't been formally amended yet. Now, if you're on a pre-approved plan document, a lot of plan sponsors, a lot of document providers may have already sent out amendments for the CARES Act and for the Secure Act. And it's okay to go ahead and adopt those. It's just that you don't have a looming deadline right now. Now, just as background, you might wonder, why would Congress extend the provision? Well, I think one of the reasons is because we do have legislation pending in Congress right now, referred to as Secure Act 2.0, the sequel, if you will. And Secure Act 2.0 might change some of the provisions that were in the original Secure Act. So I think Congress thought, well, if those provisions get enacted, we'll just give you additional time to amend the plan. So I think that's one of the reasons that these changes have been put off. Kind of scrolling down now, one also thing I'll note is that on the Fiduciary Hot Topics, when we went to print, we mentioned that the only provision of the CARES Act eligible for the 3-year extension was the extension of the suspension of MRDs. So if you were required to take an MRD in 2020, the plan could be, the operation of the plan could be changed to allow you to postpone that. So you didn't have to take your MRD. Actually, subsequent to the time we printed this Hot Topics, there really wasn't an explanation as to why the IRS extended the deadline for only one provision of the CARES Act, but not all the provisions. But no, now there was, the IRS subsequently released notice 2022-45, and they now have extended the deadline for all of the CARES Act provisions. That sentence that I've highlighted needs to be updated as well. The 3-year extension applies to all the CARES Act provisions, not just the MRD extension. When we look at the provisions of the Secure Act that have been extended, here's the ones that you kind of keep in mind. The increase in the age for MRDs extended to age 72, it was 70 and a half. The modification of the MRD rule distribution for beneficiaries. It used to be that beneficiaries could take distributions over their life expectancy. Now death benefits have to be paid out over 10 years generally. Another real important rule here that I want to just mention is this concept. I don't want us to lose sight of this, but the idea of what we call long-term part-time employees. Now remember, a long-term part-time employee is somebody who works at least 500 hours a year and does that for 3 consecutive years. And this provision became effective January 1, 2021. So the first year for that 3-year period was 2021. So you got 2021, 2022, 2023. That means long-term part-time employees may become eligible for the plan January 1, 2024. Now, remember, all you have to do is permit those employees to defer into the 401k plan. You don't have to provide top-heavy contributions, employer contributions, safe harbor contributions. You just have to give them the ability to defer. Another provision in the Secure Act was to allow for penalty-free withdrawals for birth and adoption expenses. Now, that's an optional provision. Plans aren't required to do that. But if you choose to allow in-service distributions for birth and adoption expenses, you'll need to amend the plan to allow that. And then also there was the increase in the maximum auto enrollment safe harbor. It used to be 10% increase in, you enroll people as a default, you increase 1% per year up to a maximum of 10. That maximum has now been extended to 15%, and that's for WACA plans. Okay. So the point I'll leave before we choose is that the key point here is that there is no longer a looming deadline, but I want to just make sure we're clear on distinguishing. We're distinguishing between when you have to start operating your plan in compliance with these rules. That date didn't change. These rules are in effect right now. What's changing is when you actually have to amend the plan to reflect those changes. Okay. Let's change topics now and talk a little bit about this idea of alternative investments in 401k plans. This is a hot topic right now in Congress among some members of the Republican Party. So in September, Republican lawmakers introduced a bill that, if enacted into law, will be known as the Retirement Savings Modernization Act. Now, this bill would amend ERISA to encourage fiduciaries of defined contribution plans. Now, remember, defined contribution plan is like a 401k plan or a 403b plan. The key distinction is each participant has an individual account. So it would allow defined contribution plans, encourage defined contribution plans to offer investments in less traditional asset classes, oftentimes referred to as alternative investments. Now, keep in mind that the investment menus of most 401k plans are limited to more traditional assets like U.S., international stocks and bonds. For the most part, plan fiduciaries shy away from including alternative investments because they're perceived to be less transparent, highly volatile, too risky for the average participant to invest in. Now, in the press release accompanying the bill, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, that's who's pushing this, he explained that defined benefit plans typically outperform defined contribution plans. And he says that one of the reasons they do that is because defined benefit plans are able to invest in alternative investments, such as hedge funds and private equity. He suggests in this regard that if fiduciaries of defined contribution plans have been too cautious, and if they can invest in these types of assets, then that might help returns for defined contribution plans. So the press release, here's some language from the press release down here that I thought was interesting to read. So the press release states that inflation has eroded and devalued. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this so you can see what I'm referring to. Inflation has eroded and devalued the savings many Americans spent their lives accumulating. This bill would modernize retirement plans to ensure they can provide diverse investments with higher returns. American workers and their families deserve to go about their lives with peace of mind, knowing their hard-earned money will be secure when they choose to retire. Our legislation will provide the millions of American savers invested in defined contribution plans with the option to enhance the retirement savings through access to a wide range of alternative investments. Now, what this fails to recognize is that defined benefit plans, for the most part, are managed by professional fiduciaries, people who tend to be sophisticated investors. And remember, a defined benefit plan is a pooled account. So, for example, if I'm a participant in a defined benefit plan, I don't have an individual account that I'm directing the investment of. Rather, I just participate in this pool of assets that is overseen typically by professional investment managers. Now, professional investment managers tend to know how to allocate to alternative investments. What's an appropriate asset allocation percentage and what's an appropriate alternative investment? They understand the risk. Individual participants directing their account in a defined contribution plan typically don't have that level of investment sophistication and don't understand the risk. So I think a bill like this in the context of defined contribution plans is probably, what's the old saying, a solution in search of a problem. This is not really a good idea for defined contribution plans. Now, the bill would not change existing fiduciary standards, whether it would simply clarify that alternatives may be included without violating fiduciary duties, but it doesn't create a safe harbor. So a fiduciary would still have to measure whether to include this type of investment based on the same types of fiduciary standards. The bill explicitly identifies a wide range of asset classes that are deemed permissible: commodities, public-private debt, digital assets, hedge funds, digital assets. Now, a lot of these types of investments, for example, real estate-related securities, those are already allowed, and many plans include REITs, REITs, REITs as an investment option to give people, for example, real estate investment. But the other types of investments tend to be highly volatile. Like, for example, take commodities, for example. This year, commodities have been the one probably positive investment asset class we've seen this year. Stocks are down, fixed income is down, international, emerging markets, everything's negative. Energy, though, has actually been positive. But what happens is if participants, though, would see, okay, energy did 47% this year, I'm going to put my money there. And of course, as soon as they do that, it goes down in value. Too volatile, not a good idea to include in the participant directed account. The press release goes on to say that the authors of the bill are relying on studies conducted by Georgetown University that's saying that they'll increase the returns for defined contribution plans could increase by as much as 17% annually. Well, yes and no. Remember, defined benefit plans are managed professionally. Whenever you get higher returns, what does that mean on the other side? It means you're taking more risk. You don't get risk-free return. If you're getting higher returns, it's because you're taking more risk. So once again, this is just not a good idea in defined contribution plans. And the other key thing I want to mention here is this last line right here. And this is really important. Remember, in defined benefit plans, unlike defined contribution plans, the investment risk is on the plan sponsor. In other words, the defined benefit plan promises the participant a set retirement benefit. And if the assets aren't sufficient to pay that promised benefit, then the plan sponsor has to make up the shortfall. In a defined contribution plan, the investment risk is on the participant. So once again, defined benefit plans are not a good analogy for analyzing whether alternative investments make sense. And I think a bill like this is probably not going to pass and is really probably not very well considered. Next, I'll talk about this idea of ESG inside of 401k plans. What's keeping 401k plans from adopting ESG more quickly? So ESG is popular now in the investment world. It stands, of course, for funds that take into account environmental, social, and governance factors. So these are considered non-financial factors that investors can consider in deciding whether to make an investment or not. Now, we at RPAG now, your advisor has the ability to actually screen funds based on ESG ratings, if this is something that you'd like to consider. A recent Bloomberg study indicates that ESG assets may exceed $40 trillion by the end of this year. And by 2025, 1/3 of all managed assets worldwide are expected to be in ESG strategy. So this is something that's coming. Also, when we look at plan participants, in numerous surveys, participants respond that they're concerned about sustainability, and they believe that factors beyond traditional financial or pecuniary factors should be considered. This is especially true for younger participants. Now, notwithstanding all this growing interest in ESG, 401k plans have been slow to adopt the concept. Only a small percentage of assets in 401k plans are currently allocated to ESG strategies. In fact, Vanguard did a study of their plans under a How America Saves study in 2021 and revealed that only 13% of defined contribution plans included an ESG fund. Now, one reason I think plan fiduciaries have been reluctant to add ESG factors to their plan is the uncertain regulatory status. The Department of Labor has issued proposed regulations providing plan fiduciaries with guidance in terms of whether they can use ESG factors in picking one fund versus another. And that guidance tends to change depending on who's in charge. When we have a Republican administration in place, the guidance seems to say you cannot take into account ESG factors. When the Democrats are in charge, the regulations that are then promulgated say that you can take ESG into account. Now, as I mentioned, those prior regulations have been proposed and preliminary. In December of this year, the Department of Labor is expected to issue a final rule. And that final rule is expected to say that plan fiduciaries can take into account ESG factors. But remember, it's more of a tiebreaker type test at this point. The idea being that if I'm a fiduciary and I'm selecting investment options for my plan participants to choose from, and I have two funds that are both, for example, on my RPAG scorecard, both scoring 10s, highly rated funds. One has ESG considerations, one doesn't. I can use those ESG considerations as a tiebreaker in deciding to offer that fund versus the other. But what I can't do is use those ESG factors at this point to outweigh financial considerations. All right. So you need to really kind of look at ESG as more of a tiebreaker at this point, I think, until we see the final regulations that come out. Now, another issue with ESG and 401k plans is that most 401k plan assets, I would say more than 50%, tend to now be in target date funds. And one of the reasons for that is because the target date fund is usually the default investment option for plan participants. If the participant doesn't make an affirmative investment election, his or her 401k balance gets invested into the target date fund. And right now, there's only one target date fund out there with a 5-year track record that takes into account ESG factors. That would be the Natixis Sustainable Future Funds. In 2020, BlackRock introduced its LifePath ESG Index series, and more funds like that are likely to follow. But right now, there just aren't that many target date funds with ESG flavor. As I mentioned, a final rule on ESG expected in December of this year, and we'll have more information at that point. Okay, so that wraps up my comments for the Q4 2022 Fiduciary Hot Topics. If you have any questions, please feel free to send those off to your consultant, and we'll try to get those questions answered by our ERISA department. Thank you very much.